My name's Eduardo Cadava, and in addition to being a professor in the English department, I'm also presently the Master of Wilson College, and on behalf of the college, I'd like to welcome you to the inaugural lecture of Wilson College's signature lecture series, which I'm inaugurating as part of the 50th anniversary celebration of the opening of Wilcox Hall and the Quad in 1960. We're very honored that Professor Cornel West has agreed to inaugurate our series, and I thank you all for being here with us today. I also hope that you'll come to hear the other speakers in this series, Slavoj Žižek on October 12th, Toni Morrison on March 1st, and Judith Butler at the end of March, with a date still to be specified. Before introducing Professor West, I simply wish to say that in celebrating the early years of Wilson's founding, we are celebrating the students who founded the Wilson Society and the Wilson Lodge, the early templates for Wilson College, and therefore for Princeton's residential college system, and who did so as part of a stance against privilege and exclusion, as part of a desire to create a place on campus where students could be who they were, and which would bring together faculty and students as we are doing today. I'm particularly pleased that Cornel is our first speaker, since from the very beginning of his career, he also has sought to articulate the conditions for a more just and less exclusionary world, one in which difference is valued and respected. Cornel West is the class of 1943 university professor at Princeton University. He graduated magna cum laude from Harvard and obtained his MA and PhD in philosophy at Princeton. He's taught at the Union Theological Seminary, Yale, Harvard, and the University of Paris. He's written 19 books and edited 13 books. He's best known for his books Race Matters, Democracy Matters, and for his new memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. He appears frequently on The Bill Maher Show, Colbert Report, CNN, and C-SPAN, as well as Tavis Smiley's PBS TV show. Many of you know that he made his film debut in The Matrix, and he's appeared in over 25 documentaries and films, including The Examined Life, Call and Response, Sidewalk, and Stand. He also has made 3 spoken word albums, including Never Forget, collaborating with Prince, Jill Scott, Andre 3000, Talib Kweli, Car S1, and the late Gerald Levert. And his recent spoken word interludes were featured on Terence Blanchard's Choices, which won the Grand Prix in France for the best jazz album of the year of 2009. Cornel West has a passion for engaging a vast variety of publics, and he's known for his penchant for telling the truth and for bearing witness to love and justice. I wish to close my remarks by recalling a more personal anecdote, and one that I think speaks to what makes Cornel such an impassioned, persuasive, and endearing speaker. Just after Spike Lee's film on Malcolm X came out, my friend Patricia Williams invited me to attend a discussion about Malcolm X at the Schomburg Center in Harlem. It was also the summer before Cornel and I team taught a course on Emerson for American Studies here. The discussion included Pat, Cornel, and a few biographers of Malcolm X. There were probably 250, 300 people in the audience. And after some time, a member of the audience stood up and said, "All you people up there talking about Malcolm this, Malcolm that, did any of you meet Malcolm, or are you just talking from your books?" In answer to the query, one of the biographers stood up and said, "Well, I never really met Malcolm, but I feel like I know Malcolm. You know, I read all his letters, I read his speeches, I read all of his writings. I feel like I know Malcolm." And as you can imagine, the man in the audience was just smirking at this response. But then Cornel stood up and said, "I'm with a brother over here. I never met Jesus, but I know Jesus." And everybody kind of went wild, and a friend of mine who was with me said, "You're going to team teach with this guy, you know, Mr. Charisma?" But many of us here today are fortunate enough to be able to say that we not only have met Cornel, but also that we know him and his essential work. The title of Cornel's talk today is Cultivating Critique in the Age of Obama. Please help me welcome Cornel West.
Oh, thank you so very much, my dear brother Eduardo Cadava. I was just waiting to hear what I actually said. I do not recall, but my God, that sounded like me. No, indeed, indeed. Let me say that I am blessed to be here. It is a privilege and an honor to inaugurate this series for Wilson College, and I must say there's only one person, not just at Princeton, there's not one other person in the country who could bring together Toni Morrison, Nobel Prize winner, 1993, Slavoj Žižek, who makes his way through the States every 2 years, and he's coming to Wilson College. And then Judith Butler, the finest social theorist of her generation. Let us salute my dear brother, distinguished Professor Eduardo Gadava. I must admit that when he asked me to speak, maybe 7 or 8 months ago, I think it was, that Sister Mary Ann said, we have got to do something for Brother Gadava no matter what. I said, oh, fine. We'll have conversation with students over dinner. It will be a fascinating engagement. I do about 15 to 20 each year, and then it began to grow and grow. I think it moved to McCormick one-on-one. I said, sounds like a little more than just breaking bread. Then we shifted McCosh 10. I said, oh, this is where I teach twice a week. And I want to salute each and every one of you for coming out in this heat. I hope that you are affected somewhat by the fan. I know I'm not, but but no, I'm in no rush at all. The important thing, as we know here at Princeton, we are fundamentally committed to that rich process of paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A, which is deep education. We try to convince these young, precious, and priceless students to learn how to die in order to learn how to live. So you engage in that turning of the soul, that shift from the superficial to the substantial, that shift the life of surfaces to a life of depth, that shift from the bling-bling, titillation and stimulation and obsession with material possessions and commodities, to wrestling with what it means to be human, what it means to be a featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creature born between urine and feces. And know that your body will be the culinary delight of terrestrial worms one day, unless you opt for cremation. And I do want to acknowledge the fact that this is the 119th anniversary of the death of the greatest American writer of all time, Herman Melville, September 28th, 1891. We were just at his gravesite just 4 days ago, 233rd Street in the Bronx, Woodlawn Cemetery. There's Melville, September 28th, 1891. Gone, overlooked, unknown, unpopular. Moby Dick sells hardly 500 copies. And in teaching that wonderful course that we taught together, The Age of Emerson, never forget that course, my dear brother. We recognize that the Emersonian tradition goes hand in hand with the Melvillian tradition. Moby Dick now a classic, timeless, which is to say is rooted in time, relevant to every moment, precisely because it wrestles with the question of what it means to be human, connected to cultivate and critique in any age. And that's precisely what I'd like to talk about today. I want to begin first with the epigraph of the great F.O. Matheson, Francis Otto Matheson, who helped resurrect the reputation of Herman Melville in 1941 in his classic American Renaissance. He said, would America be unique among modern nations to move between perceived innocence to corruption without a mediating stage of maturity? Committed suicide a few years later, the most distinguished literary critic of his time, professor, American literature, Harvard University, master of Eliot House, jumped off a hotel top, downtown Boston, wrestling with despair, disappointment, despondency, wrestling with his gay identity, yes. One of the towering Christian thinkers of his day, deeply influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr, probably the most influential Christian thinker of his day. But the shift from perceived innocence to corruption without a mediating stage of maturity, growing old, growing wealthy without growing up. The second quote comes from a Princetonian, O.F. Scott Fitzgerald. Didn't last long, but he bounced back. In so many ways, Princeton's still proud of him. Alcohol and all. It's a wonderful line in his 1938 essay I hope that each and every student at Princeton reads, called The Crack Up. It's published in Esquire magazine. He says that the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in your mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Two opposing ideas, like America, grand experiment, noble experiment in democracy and self-government. And like America, empire, settler society, expanding, subjugating indigenous peoples, their precious babies, and their land, enslaving Africans, confining sisters of all colors to domestic space with hardly any public status until 1920, subjugating workers. You see. Two ideas in the mind at the same time and retaining the ability to function. And the last epigraph comes from the great Martin Luther King Jr. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr. is someone who means so much to all of us. I decided when I was 14 years old, for the rest of my life, I was going to attempt to make the world safe for the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. We've got a towering public intellectual here from Chicago, Brother Dwight McGee, sitting right on the corner here, who did the same thing when he was young, that he was going to devote his life to making the world safe for the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. I see Sister Cynthia Biggs sitting next to her, the great scholar and the artist, writing for the Stylistics, writing for Patti LaBelle. What a hybrid, magnificent identity. Same commitment to Martin King, Sister Monique as well. What did Martin say? Right before Martin was shot, right on that balcony, Lorraine Motel, Memphis, Tennessee, April 4th, 1968, he wrote down a piece of paper. Would you please send this to Ebenezer Baptist Church? This will be the subject of my sermon. And the subject of his sermon was, America may go to hell. That's Martin. He didn't say America should go to hell. He didn't say America ought to go to hell. He said America may go to hell. And he said it with tears in his eyes. Because at that particular moment, he knew that there was a decline and decay setting in the American empire, and the noble experiment in democracy was very fragile and being pushed to the edge, slowly rolling down a slope to chaos. And little did he know, in a few hours he would be shot. And little did he know there would be over 175 rebellions in over 175 cities. The first time since the Civil War, they would call the National Guard to protect the White House because some very angry and enraged black people with a few white allies were going to de-whitenize the White House. Oh, my God, it's hard to conceive of that now, isn't it? 2010, the things were that far out of control. But Melville understood it. Keep track of Ahab. Keep track of the egotism. Keep track of the egoism What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to connect the quest for truth, the endless quest for truth, with the pursuit of justice, the perennial pursuit of justice? So I want to begin in talking about critique in the age of Obama, not to focus on President Obama himself, even though he will make a cameo appearance, but to raise the question to each and every one of you in this particular age. How do you understand what it means to be human? Do you really muster the courage? Do you forge the courage to cultivate critique? What kind of human being do you really choose to be in your move from mother's womb to tomb? What kind of legacy do you actually want to bear? What will people say about you when you are in your coffin, in your grave, be it in Woodlawn or any other place, and people will say, oh, this is the kind of witness that she bore. These are the kind of ideas they pursued. This is the kind of life they enacted. This is the kind of cultivation of critique they exemplified. And here at Princeton, we're all about this Socratic quest of cultivating critique. Anytime we talk about cultivating critique, we begin with ourselves. You see, what is my role in this particular moment in the history of the American empire and the American experiment in democracy? I see. How do I spend my time? What kind of priorities will I have? How will I deploy the energy? What gifts do I have? Will I actually give those gifts? What impact will the giving have before I make my move off the stage of space and time? These are existential questions. It's not just about schooling. It's not just about acquiring skills. It's not just about networking. Is not just about passing through in order to gain access to some dynamite job and title and status to live in some vanilla suburb, maybe living large, but I don't know, with the economy it's difficult to even talk about living large these days. Maybe for the top 1%, we'll get to them. But even the professional crisis, given the problems of the economy, are real. But this is an existential question. So cultivating critique is not just a matter of some external activity to who you are, to your identity, your humanity, your personality, your sense of the uniqueness and the distinctiveness of the you, given that there's only one you in the world and there shall never be another you in the world. So 38A of Plato's Apology, the unexamined life is not worth living. Melville adds, the examined life painful. William Butler Yeats, and all that wonderful book by Michael Wood. Michael Wood is one of our finest professors in humanities here. He's written a wonderful book called Yeats and Violence. I want to recommend that book to each and every one of you. Just published last month. Over 300 pages looking at one poem, 1919. Published in 1921, but 1919. Examination of one poem. And William Butler Yeats used to say, it takes more courage to examine the dark corners of your own soul than it does for a soldier to fight on the battlefield. Young Princetonians, brothers and sisters of all colors, do we older, old school people have that courage to criticize ourselves and our society and our history? And I begin with myself, being shaped in the sunny state of California, shaped by the social movements of the 1960s, and most importantly, shaped by the legacy of Martin King. And in those days, there was no such thing as a race card. A lot of people were playing cards and the whole deck was stacked, but there was no such thing as a race card. It was a freedom movement. And Martin Luther King Jr. was part of a tradition of cultivating critique that said we are looking at the world from the vantage point of the least of these. Echoes of the 25th chapter of Matthew, and the least of these: orphan, widow, poor, working, gay brother, lesbian sister, Jew, Muslim, Arab, any persons who are being pushed to the margins. So what does America look like from the vantage point of the slave? Frederick Douglass, we'd like to hear from you. What do you have to say? The most eloquent of ex-slaves in the history of the modern world. We want a conception of democracy that radically democratizes the U.S. Constitution, because the U.S. Constitution made no reference to the institution of slavery, yet 22% of the inhabitants of the 13 colonies were enslaved Africans. Their very labor was a precondition for the democracy, just as indigenous peoples' lands and babies subjugated were preconditions for U.S. democracy. Frederick Douglass, what do you have to say? I want a conception of freedom and democracy that holds for everybody. I don't want the enslavement of those who enslave me. I want freedom for everybody. I cultivate critique in the name of the best of who I am, the name of the best of the tradition that shaped me, and in the name of the best of the democratic experiment that was built in part on the backs of my descendants and myself. Emmett Till's mother, what do you have to say? You all know who Emmett Till was, a young brother who was shot down by American terrorists, by cowardly white supremacists in gut bucket Jim Crow, Mississippi in August of 1955. His body thrown in the Tallahatchie River. Her only child. How do you cultivate critique, Mrs. Till? Bring my baby back to the south side of Chicago. Keep the casket open for 3 days. Let the world see what America looks like from the vantage point of one who has been victimized by American terrorists. And those American terrorists do not speak on behalf of the vast majority of white brothers and sisters, even when many of them are relatively silent. But too many of these precious human beings in the South are being lynched or killed randomly and arbitrarily. Mrs. Till, how do you cultivate critique? In the age of Jim Crow and Jane Crow, in the age of American terrorism, you all recall what she said when she stepped to the lectern and looked over and saw her precious baby with tears flowing. She was Socratic in her questioning. She was prophetic in her witness. She said, I don't have a minute to hate. I will pursue justice for the rest of my life. Cultivating critique means what? Yes, interrogating. Yes, learning how to die by pushing back and letting go certain assumptions and presuppositions so that one can be reborn, revitalized, regenerated into a more decent human being, a more loving person, a more compassionate person. But even with the tears flowing, she was cultivating critique, and even with her only child in the coffin at 14 years old, she knew the difference between justice and revenge. She didn't need to read Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice to know the difference between justice and revenge. She didn't have to listen to the peroration of Portia to reflect on the quality of mercy. She came out of a great tradition that cultivated critique, that kept track of America as democratic experiment and America as empire. And we should just add as a footnote, even the founding fathers, because I know we've got a number of my dear conservative brothers and sisters. I'm not just talking about those in the Tea Party and others who are obsessed with the founding fathers. But of course, George Washington called America an infant empire. Thomas Jefferson called it an empire of liberty. And Alexander Hamilton said it is the most interesting empire in the world. Those are right there in the text. So they knew it was a republic with democratic institutions, but they also knew it was an empire. What is an empire? An empire is a mover and a shaker in an international system where you're attempting to convince other peoples to be subordinate to you, either by force or coercion or by diplomacy and persuasion. But in the end, you want your interests and your security and your view of the world to be accepted by them. And it is rare in the history of this nation that we understand the imperial dimensions of the American democratic project. But when you look at America from the vantage point of those below, those in Latin America after 1823 with the Monroe Doctrine, and the hundreds of interventions, you see, or those in Africa, when they see the tentacles of the U.S. government, and why Nelson Mandela would be called a terrorist. He was just taken off the terrorist list about 6 years ago, and he had been president of South Africa 10 years earlier. What's Nelson Mandela doing on the terrorist list? Somebody got something wrong. But he cultivated critique in the age of apartheid in his nation. And he, like Emmett Till's mother, could make the difference between justice and revenge. I want fairness across the board. And the tradition that we need to accent in the age of Obama is precisely the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., of Fannie Lou Hamer, the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who used to say indifference to evil is more evil than evil itself, because indifference makes each and every one of us want to opt for lives where we're well adjusted to injustice. We define success as being well adapted to indifference, to turn our backs with the suffering of poor people and working people just for us to ascend to our own individual success. And it means radically cutting against the grain. And the tradition that I'm talking about today is very weak. It's very feeble. And believe me, when the American Gibbon puts pen to paper and writes the magisterial text about the decline and fall of the American empire, it will have much to do with the weakening and the feeble status of a legacy of cultivating critique tied to the pursuit of justice that cut against the grain to keep alive a very fragile yet precarious experiment in democracy called the USA. And believe me, there will come a time when the precious experiment in a democracy called America comes to an end. No social experiment lasts forever. No democracy lasts forever. No empire lasts forever. And I want to say to my young brothers and sisters of all colors, I hope and pray that it's not on your watch. That the fall, the decline is already set in. We older folk have passed to you the decline. The decline of the American empire is very, very real. Very real. The greed has been running amok for 30 years. The age of Reagan. Greed is good. Lives of rich and famous. To be human is to land in the lap of luxury and be so thoroughly titillated and stimulated that you aspire to the highest levels of the culture of superficial spectacle and be a celebrity and feel good about yourself, if only for a moment. And what happens to our poor peoples? What happens to our working peoples? Their wages stagnant for 20 years. Productivity way up. Profits way up until 2008. 1973. 2008. Begins with Democrats. This is not a matter of trashing Republicans. I'm a Christian. I try to love everybody. I don't like what they do. I hate some deeds, but I try to love the doer. Just like I hate the sin, but I try to love the sinner, you see. But beginning with Jimmy Carter, the dogma sets in. Very few people want to critique the dogma. What is the dogma? Free market fundamentalism. Deregulate. Let those markets become unfettered. They are self-correcting. They work on their own. The end and aim of life is to pursue short-term profit now. for short-term pleasure, short-term power, short-term property. Unleash the markets, these magical entities that somehow in an invisible way generate unbelievable levels of productivity and growth. Be greedy, it feels good, doesn't it? It's Oliver Stone, 1987 in Wall Street. I haven't seen the new version yet. Have you seen it yet, Eduardo? New York Times says it's not as good, but I don't believe the New York Times. They get so much wrong, but I do read the darn thing every day anyway. Have to be informed to know how to avoid being uninformed. The dogma, free market fundamentalism, goes hand in hand with what? Indifference toward the poor. Hand in hand with a highly polarized body politic, race baiting, gay baiting, lesbian baiting, Jew baiting, Arab baiting, Muslim baiting, scapegoat the most vulnerable, don't confront the most powerful, join the most powerful. We saw it here at Princeton. We taught at Princeton in the mid-late 80s. Reaganism was running amok. Everybody couldn't wait to get to Wall Street. Sophomore year, I think I'm dropping out. What you going to do? I'm going to Wall Street. How come Bill Gates dropped out as freshman? I'm late. Why you want to be like Bill Gates? He made money. Oh, is that your conception of what it is to be human? Have you ever heard of material prosperity juxtaposed with spiritual malnutrition? Have you ever heard of material prosperity juxtaposed with moral constipation? Knowing what's right and good, but stuck and just can't get it out. Too much greed, too much jealousy, too much avarice. It doesn't flow. And you're going to jail. I apologize. I knew what was right. I just was a little out of control. You've been looting billions of dollars for years. Yeah, it became habitual. Oh, really? And of course, we laugh in order to keep from crying. Because this was just not a national affair. This is a transatlantic affair. Reagan, Thatcher, the ideology of Milton Friedman tied to that other September 11, 1973 in Chile. Free those markets. Eliminate those social nets. Let everybody be self-making and personally responsible. And let the winner gain access to as much as he or she can. And you can just hear Martin Luther King Jr. from the grave saying, you're going to reap what you sow. Chickens come home to roost. What's in the wash will come out in the rinse. Greed will only take you so far. There's a wonderful book, actually, by Robert Kochman, one of the great public intellectuals in the 1980s. He wrote a book called Greed is Not Enough. I think I see Brother Jeff Stout in the back there. He knows what I'm talking about. He's been wrestling with this issue for the last 30 years in defense of democracy. Sister Sally sitting right next to him. Brother Eric Gregory sitting right next to him. Same legacy. He decided long time ago, white brother from Vanilla, Ewing, and Trenton, I'm going to keep alive the legacy of Martin King because it's a moral choice, because it's an ethical decision. This is the kind of human being I want to be. In the 1980s and the 1990s were difficult for persons like myself. Lucky to make it through. Glad I didn't go crazy. I guess some people think I did, but that's a matter of opinion. Radically cutting against the grain. Trade union movement weaker and weaker. Feminist movement strong but incorporated within. The culture obsessed with market sensibilities of buying and selling and making and mending. Obsessed with material possessions. You see. The black movement. Weak, feeble, but Jesse Jackson leading the effort to cultivate critique in the age of Reagan. The significance of Barack Obama is that he attempted, along with his campaign, to bring to an end the age of Reagan. Instead of greed, he talked about fairness. Instead of indifference, he talked about compassion. Instead of the politics of fear that divide and conquer, he talked about what? Hope. And it was a golden moment. A golden moment. I did 65 events for that brother, beginning in Iowa. And I just started wearing an overcoat in the last few months, so I was stuck in Iowa at 4 degrees in the afternoon with no coat. So you know I had a deep love of the cause that would lead me to campaign for him under those circumstances. Ended in Ohio. And I was not impressed with Obama the first time I heard him speak. Most of the country was deeply impressed. Not me. No, and I heard a black man step to the lectern and say, America is a magical land with limitless possibility. I said, which country is he talking about? I said, this brother's going to have a Christopher Columbus experience. He's going to discover America. There's nothing magical about America. It's a slice of humanity who, out of great courage and vision and service to public interest, convinced enough citizens to forge empathy and imagination to keep alive a democratic experiment. That's called blood, sweat, and tears. This is not Disneyland or Disney World. Nothing magical going on. Look at Arlington Cemetery. You see anything magical about that, those precious lives lost? You see something magical about Martin Luther King's life getting shot down like a dog at 39 years old? Nothing magical about that. Or Philip Barrigan, a Catholic brother, or Dorothy Day, the Catholic sister. These are human beings who are heroic. They are extraordinary in their ordinariness and ordinary in their extraordinariness. And if we don't generate people like that in your generation, we're going to lose the American democratic experiment. The empire will decline. The worst of America will come forward, and it's the worst of any society. Bitterness, bigotry, cynicism, cruelty, revenge, resentment. It's always there. The great Reinhold Niebuhr used to say what? Democracy is a proximate solution to insoluble problems. You're never going to do away with envy and resentment and bitterness, not with finite creatures with insecurities and anxieties in the face of their literal extinction in terms of their bodies. There's something called deep fear. Touch that fear and manipulate that fear. That's how you ought to proceed. Here comes the legacy of deep democracy. We're going to cut against the grain. So when I heard Barack Obama, I said, I said some of that on television. And he called me up. He said, Brother West, why would you say those things about me? I said, my dear brother, I said it because I believe it. I'm not one of these ordinary pundits who just says things in order to keep the bottom line in place, to make big money by sensationalizing things. I try, to the best of my finite, fallible ability, to speak the truth. You mean you really believe what you said? Who you been hanging out with? Of course I believe what I said. I'm that kind of Jesus-loving free black man. I try to speak the truth and bear witness in my fallible way before I die. Do you want to know some other things that I think? And we talked for 4 hours, and I had one question for Barack Obama. What is your relation to the legacy of Martin King as an elected official at the end of the age of Reagan? He gave his analysis. I gave mine. And I said, I hereby decide to be an advisor, no money, no strings attached whatsoever, because to remain free, you had to stay distant from the money. I said, I will be a supporter, but I will be a Socratic and prophetic supporter. He said, what the heck is that? I said, I will try to tell the truth. And the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. When I go to Iowa, I will allow the suffering of my brothers and sisters of all colors in Iowa to speak. When I go to Ohio, I'll do the same thing. When I go to South Carolina, I'll do the same thing. I will say this in the name of my support of your campaign, but at the same time, I will be critical of you. And the moment that you win, I'm going to break dance for 2 hours that afternoon in celebration. But by the same night, I'm going to be your major critic, because the shift from campaigning to governing is a radical one. And that you will emerge not just as the president of America, United States, and not just as the head of the American democratic experiment. You're going to be head of the empire. You walk in that Oval Office and see that button, oh, that's the A bomb, oh, that's the H bomb. Oh, these are the 95 U.S. bases nobody knows about but me and the Pentagon. Oh, those, I'm keeping track of those drones killing those folk in Pakistan and Somalia and Yemen. New York Times might pick it up 3 weeks later and it's news to us. They already know. Oh my God, here's the list of wiretappers. Professor West, what's he doing on there? I thought he was my friend. He must be doing things that's un-American. I got to talk to somebody about this. These are the folk involved in torture. No longer waterboarding, but still force feeding. Is Pogrom still open in Afghanistan? Yes. Is Guantanamo still open? Yes. It's a different situation now. You head of the empire. Over 700 military bases, a ship in every sea, 1.4 million soldiers, decisions to be made on the spot. And then when he made his choice of his economic team, here comes my dear brother, Tim Geithner. Here comes my dear brother, Larry Summers. Straight out of the Wall Street financial oligarchic culture. Themselves promoting the deregulated markets. It was under Clinton that we eliminated the Glass-Steagall Act that allowed for commercial banks and investment banks to come together, so banks are no longer preoccupied with lending but trading and speculation in the shadow financial system that so many critics have written about, where billions of dollars were made on sheer speculation with no substantial contribution to the real economy, at a time in which wages are declining, at a time in which 20% of America's children are living in poverty. Can you imagine that? The richest nation in the history of the world has 20% of their precious, priceless children of all colors living in poverty? Other comparable industrial nations, 3%, 4%. Brown children, 39%. Red children, 42%. Black children, 39%. Poverty educates. What does the future look like? We were just at prisons today. I was just at Trenton State. 2.5 hours this morning. The maximum security prison in New Jersey, the only one, right off Cass Street. And I walk in and see all these beautiful faces. Hundreds of them, 72% of them there for nonviolent offenses, drug offenses, soft drug offenses. 72%, disproportionately black and brown. Of course, black and brown young people engage in illegal drug intake, about 14%. Precious white brothers and sisters, same age, about 14%. Arrests, 40% black and brown. Convictions, 70%. And I say to myself, I've been around Princeton every once in a while on Thursday and Friday night on Prospect. And I know there's not a lot of paideia taking place that night. There's nothing wrong with social activity, but my hunch is there's some Princeton students flying high in the friendly skies sometimes. And my hunch is that if they had the same level of enforcement of drug laws, even at our beloved Princeton, as they do in the chocolate city of Trenton, the jails would be more colorful. Now, I don't want any Princeton students to go to jail. Don't misunderstand me. I'm talking about differential treatment. I'm talking about double standards. I'm talking about rule of law being arbitrarily deployed. In the same way that welfare mothers call for help They're told, pull yourself up by your own bootstrap. Investment banks collapse and call for help. Billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars are found immediately in the context of a budgetary crisis, you see. And poor people and working people say, well, wait a minute, we've been waiting for a Marshall Plan. And during the age of Reagan, they got a Marshall Plan. It's called a carceral Marshall Plan. Over $300 billion spent in jails, prison, criminal justice system, not education, not job skills centers, but for prisons. In fact, the prison industry is now the third biggest employer in the nation behind Manpower, Inc. and Walmart. So the money can be found. Of course, we know that Iraq is the same way. We have no money. Here's billions of dollars for an invasion based on mendacity. And now it's spilling over to almost $1 trillion as the combative troops have been brought back. In the age of Barack Obama, how is he going to somehow keep alive the best of this legacy of Martin King that I'm talking about? I don't know about you, but I never lose hope, but I am never, ever optimistic. So people run around, oh, you know, this project of hope, now I'm just losing hope. This despair is overwhelming me. I thought that Obama was really going to come through. And it is true that some people thought Barack was Jesus for about a week and a half. Oh, he's the Messiah. He's going to deliver. Oh, he's so charismatic. His rhetoric is magnificent. Democratic is soaring. Then you look at his team. Here come the economic team. Oh, my God. Technocrats tied to corporate elites. No serious concern with jobs. Jobs always an afterthought. We've got to have a recovery for Wall Street before Main Street. No concern about the jobs, the homes with mortgages collapsing and foreclosures escalating and bankruptcy on the horizon. No, we got to get Wall Street in place first. That's what the economic team was about. Why? Because they still were deeply affected by that dogma. They hadn't cultivated critique deep enough. It's through those strong, relatively free markets with hardly any significant regulation. So Barack Obama steps on the historical stage with great dignity and charisma, and I was still glad to support him. I would support him again if, in retrospect, I would probably get an overcoat. I wouldn't catch pneumonia like I almost did. But I would be there because it was very important to bring the age of Reagan to a close. But in cultivating critique in the age of Obama today, after the breakthrough, healthcare reform, progress, but not substantial progress. You see, pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies, the stocks hit the top of the sky after the act was passed. How come? Not just more profits, but because they knew there was no competition, no public option at all, you see. Financial reform, progress, yes. Thank God for Elizabeth Warren. Thank God for an agency that can keep track of consumers. Princeton's own Ralph Nader, class of 1955. He says, oh, I've been trying to protect consumers for the last 50 years. We now have an agency to do so, but it's within the Federal Reserve. It's not independent. It's not autonomous. It's still subsumed under the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is supposed to be fundamentally committed to full employment. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine somebody writing the history of the decline of America saying, was there an institution that was supposed to keep track of full employment? Absolutely, it was the Federal Reserve. Well, when did they actually take their mission seriously? Well, they had another one too called financial stability. And financial stability trumped full employment. And financial stability meant keeping especially those at the top stable as working people's lives became more chaotic, full of more social misery, full of more suffering, downward mobility, the losing of jobs, and so forth and so on. Where does that leave us? Well, that's the question I want to end with each and every one of you. Because as I said, I am in no way losing hope. Because I'm a blues man in the life of the mind. The blues man is a prisoner of hope. The blues man is a veteran of hope. Just like Emmett Till's mother. She's an ambassador of hope. In no way optimistic. I don't believe in optimism. It's a secular myth. Things always look dark if you look close enough from the vantage point of those who are suffering below. But hope is something else. Hope is something else. When B.B. King says, nobody loves me but my mama, and she might be jiving too, there's no hope there. Or I should say there's no optimism there. It's full of hope by the song sung. You see, to cultivate critique. You see, to bear witness to justice. Put love of the other at the center of one's quest for justice, understanding justice being what love looks like in public. You see. And the only hope that we have is to stay in motion, in movement, with a vision tied to something bigger than ourselves. It could be a vision of justice, a vision of fairness. That's the legacy of Martin, rooted in black people's struggle, but spilling over to all parts of the country and the world. But to cultivate that critique and attempt to tell the truth means then that in cutting against the grain, you have to get used to being marginal, sometimes isolated, being on the periphery, being much more obsessed with being great, defining greatness in terms of quality of service to others and depth of compassion for others, especially the least of these, and being successful. And that requires a whole different conception of what it is to be human, as opposed to the dominant conception of what it is to be human emerging out of the age of Reagan with its materialism and hedonism and narcissism and rapacious individualism. Where's the common good? Where's the public interest? Where's the larger conceptions that have made America what it is at its best? Does this generation have what it takes? Do each and every one of you have what it takes to keep the legacy of Martin King and the others alive? Here in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Latin America as well. It's like the conclusion of a practical Aristotelian syllogism. It's not a proposition. It's a way of life. It's a mode of existence. What kind of person will you choose to be in your move from mama's womb to tomb? And history's waiting. And if we somehow can hold off that American Gibbon who's so anxious to write the decline and fall of the American empire and say, oh, wait, don't come to the conclusion. The Princeton undergraduates have yet to speak and yet to act. We shall see. Thank you all so very much. Oh, you're very kind. I know it's hot out there. It's hot out there. Indeed, you're very kind to stay so long. We've got good time for question and answer, and we have the reception, too, that we're going to. We're celebrating Wilson now. Wilson College. Well, to have a black man celebrating Woodrow Wilson, you know I got deep love. You know I got deep love. No, but Woodrow Wilson and Brother West were part of the same tradition. It's a rich tradition. Tradition that has Rumsfeld and Nader and Edward Said and a whole host of others. That's called the Princeton tradition. It's complex, complicated, and fascinating. Questions, queries, please don't hesitate. Yes, my dear sister. Yes. How you doing there?
My question is about
about how Obama, being head of the empire, concerned with American hegemony on the one hand, concerned with American national security, rightfully so. American interest, depends how you define it. Is it the interest of poor and working people? Is it the interest of corporate America? We have to debate that, right? But how does he do it in such a way that he shows a concern for the least of these? I think in order for him to do that in a serious way would require a significant break from the dominant tendencies in U.S. foreign policy. You see, the first thing you do in Latin America is to say, we no longer are going to support any military coups against democratically elected officials. It's easier said than done when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, but that's a good start, like Honduras, you see. It doesn't mean that you become an uncritical supporter of Brother Hugo Chavez at all. You try to make sure that Chavez is protecting rights, protecting liberties, and so forth. But you also see the ways in which there's been significant empowerment of the poor and the ways in which oligarchic classes in Venezuela are very afraid because their social order is being threatened. In the same way, of course, that elites anywhere are going to be deeply fearful when their social order is being threatened. Martin King put a lot of fear in certain elites when their social order was threatened, you see. We can go issue by issue. Israeli-Palestinian issue. I think Obama tell the world, Jewish brothers and sisters are precious. They have been hated for 2,000 years. Their security is unnegotiable. We are going to ensure they are forever protected. At the same time, we are unequivocally against any form of occupation. So even if they occupy a people, if they occupy Palestinians, it is unjust. And we're going to talk seriously about Israeli security being both fundamental and justice for Palestinians being fundamental, and that the life of a Jew in Tel Aviv is precious, and the life of a Palestinian on the West Bank is precious, and we're going to proceed in that way. Now, of course, if he said that, his career is over in U.S. politics. He said, oh, Brother West, you can say that at Princeton as a professor because you're a free man. But I've got to deal with the practical issues of influence and power and lobbies and so forth and so on. I said, yes, but you have got to learn the lesson of Abe Lincoln. It's one reason I love Abe Lincoln so. Because he had deep white supremacist sensibilities on one level and he hated slavery on the other. But Abe Lincoln was willing to grow. He listened to white sisters like Harriet Beecher Stowe when she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. He listened to Frederick Douglass, the great figure I invoked before. He listened to Wendell Phillips and Charles Sumner, those powerful freedom fighters in the U.S. Congress fighting against slavery. And he changed his mind. Lincoln cultivated critique. You read the first inaugural address. I support the first proposed 13th Amendment, which was what? Slavery in America forever. That's Abe Lincoln. Read the second inaugural address. They've got it in the Lincoln Memorial in D.C. It's the most sublime moment of American rhetoric in the history of this democratic experiment. He's a different man. He grew. He learned how to die in order to learn how to live. That's where Obama started. He started in Springfield. And I told Obama explicitly, I said, brother, look, if you starting in Springfield and you're going to use Abe Lincoln as your standard, and you end up looking like Bill Clinton, that's like John Coltrane and Kenny G. I mean, we like both of them, but we know the difference. And if you're going to be Kenny G, pick up your saxophone and play Kenny G. And Clinton was known for what? His opportunism. Clinton is not any grand, courageous person with backbone. He signed a welfare bill Ronald Reagan wouldn't have signed. Reagan said it was too cruel. Why did Clinton sign it? For opportunistic reasons, to win the election. Why did he sign the crime bill? 3 strikes you out, mandatory sentences. To steal thunder from the right wing, to triangulate. That doesn't show courage. Lincoln said what? I've changed my mind. Everybody said, what? Politician change your mind? Admit you're wrong? Oh my God, you do it on the Fox News, the whole channel would collapse. You do it on CNN, the whole channel would collapse. You do it on MSNBC. I'd like to see my dear sister Rachel Maddow say, I think that the Tea Party has got some real insight. I'd like to hear her say that, because I think Tea Party movement does have insight. They say the government's corrupt. They're right. The government's been captured by big finance and big business. Everybody knows you got 13,700 lobbyists in Washington, $6.5 billion spent just this year. That's corruption. That's legalized bribery, normalized corruption. I hear the Tea Party brothers and sisters say, the government's corrupt. I said, you're absolutely right. I said, but why are you so anti-government? Why not just make the government more accountable, especially to working and poor people? You see? We need more personal responsibility. You are absolutely right. That includes investment bankers, it includes students at Princeton, it includes corporate elites, it includes trade unions, it includes persons across the board. We need more entrepreneurial possibility. Absolutely right. Then why is it, Tea Party brothers and sisters, you're so tied to a hyper-corporate agenda with these billionaires providing money behind your populism? The contradictions are too overwhelming. But I accept your insights. I don't accept their conclusions. That's Lincoln. That's called wisdom. That's called prudence. That's not name-calling. That's not opportunism. That's the standard that Brother Barack Obama, now President Obama, set at the very beginning. So far, he looks like Clinton. No backbone, waits to see which way things are going, reads the polls, and then strategizes, and then spins. And he's got Brother Rahm Emanuel, the masterful spinner. And I'm talking about the spinners with Felipe Wynn. I'm talking about political spinner. You see. And American people are upset. In fact, in so many ways, I think he could have nipped the Tea Party movement in the bud if he had hit jobs and homes early on so that the populism didn't get a chance to go right wing. Could have been a progressive populism. But he left the jobs and homes dangling. People are deeply affected by the loss of jobs, the loss of homes. And he says, I've got a health care project that kicks in the next 4 or 5 years. 4 or 5 years, the worms would have got me by then, Barack. I'd be so broke as the 10 Commandments that I would begin to think about getting over by any means that Wall Street obsession with the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. Just push the envelope as far as you can. Get as much money now and hope you don't get caught. What an ethos. What an ethic. What an example for the rest of the nation. No democracy can survive with that kind of pervasive gangster-like orientation toward the world. There's got to be non-market values, like love and fidelity and trust and justice and fairness, public exchange based on civility and so forth. Boy, that's a long answer to your question, but you are a graduate student in politics, so yes, go right ahead. Uh-huh. Do I think Barack Obama has a long way to go in terms of cultivating critique? Do I think he's done certain things that exemplify cultivation of critique? Do I think he's done things that warrant serious critique? I've been accenting the latter. I'll tell you one of the things I love about Barack Obama's administration, and that is the AmeriCorps program. 250,000 people moving into public service. It's something that Clinton initiated. It's something that I think is so very important for young brothers and sisters of all colors. Don't allow yourself to be 30 years old and have no experience whatsoever in working for some kind of public service institution. Because if you live a thoroughly privatized life, you're going to miss out on the joys of serving others and experiencing what it's like to have something given to you because you give, as opposed to something given to you because you consumed it. And Barack Obama initially expanded AmeriCorps. It was a beautiful thing that he did. I think he's been very important on the green issue, bringing in some magnificent people to work on the green issue, just unable to push it through. And of course, you know, the obstructionism of the Republican Party cannot be overlooked. I haven't accented that because I've tried not to be so partisan on a concrete level. I didn't come here to defend the Democratic Party, Republican Party. You can see if you're going to cultivate critique, you got to be critical of both and the ways in which they're tied to big business and big finance and so on, you see. So yes, I think he's done some things that are significant. Mm-hmm. Yes, my dear brother, go right ahead. Yeah.
My name is David. I'm a freshman engineer. I'd just like to know, how would you use the experiment of democracy in America to further love, compassion, human interconnectedness, if not through the empire? What other ways would you use?
No, I appreciate the question, no, brother. Very much so. I mean, I wrote a book 6 years ago called Democracy Matters, where I try to answer that question. I try to talk about how could we, in fact, create a democratic experiment that eliminated poverty, ensured that working people had access to a living wage, had near full employment, certainly still had markets, but markets that were regulated under ideals of justice that allowed both innovation with small scale and medium scale size. You see, I am suspicious of bigness across the board. Big finance, downsize the banks. Big business, downsize the corporations. Big government, curtail excessive spending, keep accountability in public bureaucracy, you see, with a focus on poor and working people as a primary or starting point, as it were, you see. And then I'd also be, I mean, the issue of U.S. foreign policy, of course, is a separate kind of thing, because I think I would also be very suspicious of the ever-expanding money spent by the Pentagon and others, not just based on weapons that are no longer needed, but also based on a mentality of thinking that somehow when you're talking about the Pentagon, you're talking about issues of national security. But when you're talking about poor children who gain access to dilapidated school systems and disgraceful housing, that's not an issue of national security. I view both issues of national security. And in fact, this week we're pretty preoccupied with education, aren't we? With the new film and so forth and so on. And the educational system, when it comes to poor and working people in our public institutions, it's been a matter of national emergency for a long, long time. But let me put it this way. 31% of working poor people are unemployed. If 31% of the well-to-do in America were unemployed, do you think we'd have a national emergency? Hell yes. No doubt. Right. 31% of poor males in inner city are either in prison, on parole, or on probation. Do you think if 30% of the well-to-do children were on parole, in prison, or on probation, we'd have a national emergency? Absolutely. We'd have town meetings all across the nation. TV stations would be going at it. Well, wait a minute now. Each life, same value, same significance. Why one slice, the way things are. Another slice, oh, now we got a major issue. We saw that with Columbine, right? Black high schools, people getting shot every day. White high school in Columbine, somebody gets shot. Oh, my God, we've got to understand the context. You know, I don't know what's wrong with our kids now. We've got to be more sensitive. We've got to love them more. Can we have a national discussion on the plight of young people because they're shooting each other now? That's news to you? Have you kept track of what's been going on for the last 40 years in high schools in the inner cities? I was just in Detroit the first day of school, 2 shot in front of one high school the first day of school. No serious discussion. Why? Well, that's the way things are, you know. And of course, let us hope and pray it never happens at Princeton High School. I love Princeton High School. I get a chance to speak there once every 3 or 4 years. But if it happened in front of Princeton High School, do you think there'd be a major discussion? New York Times had picked that thing up, and the next thing you know, Charlie Rose and everybody else talking about, we've got an epidemic now. These kids are killing each other. Yeah, they've been doing it for a long time. You see, differential treatment, differential perception. That's one of the things you have to fight if you're going to have a durable, robust democracy for a long time. Question in the back. Yeah. Ralph Waldo Emerson used to say, whoso would be a man or woman would be a nonconformist. And that's in part what I was talking about. That if you refuse to be well-adjusted to injustice, what does that make you? Maladjusted. I am a maladjusted man. And I'll die maladjusted, you see. The great Arthur Miller wrote a play called The Misfits. People who don't want to fit into or fit in too easily an unjust status quo. You become a misfit. It doesn't mean you don't have friends, because there are a lot of misfits around. You hang out together, kick it, have a good time, reflect on things, talk about what kind of nonconformist are you? This, interesting. Doesn't mean you don't have a relation with the conformist. I mean, I'm at Princeton University, so it's not like I'm in some progressive institution preoccupied just with progressive critiques. No, not at all. Right, I'm going to have a wonderful dialogue with my dear brother Robbie George tomorrow night. I think right here, right? Absolutely, and I love my brother. He just happens to be wrong on a lot of things. And he loves me, and he thinks I'm wrong on a lot of things. Now, of course, he feels maladjusted at Princeton because he's a deeply conservative brother, and Princeton has a much more liberal hegemony in terms of its students and faculty. So I can understand the kind of maladjustment he has. His is different than mine. You see, I'm maladjusted as a leftist vis-a-vis the liberal. He's maladjusted as a deep conservative vis-a-vis the liberal. So we have some things in common, and we're both Christians too, so we try to work that out, and we come to the cross and dip in the blood and try to keep things loving and what have you see. But the life of a maladjusted person who is fundamentally committed to trying to tell the truth and bear witness to justice is often a life of isolation and loneliness, because you are radically cutting against the grain. And even when you're part of a group, it's still a small group, you see. And that group means very much to you, especially as you get older. That's one of the reasons why I mention all these names. So when I'm talking about Brother Dwight and Brother Jeff and so forth, I'm having memories of the dinners that we've had and the luncheons that we had. Right when I'm on the edge, they come forth and help me out and so forth. And the same with me. But I don't want to disclose any private things. I know Brother Jeff has been on the edge at times. And I know Dwight's been on the edge at times. Absolutely. But we help each other out of deep love and support. And we all don't agree on things either, of course. You're not supposed to agree across the board. That's not what it's about. It's about preserving the integrity of the process of critique, but also trying to live a life that in some way conforms to the critique that is nonconformist vis-a-vis a society that is often operating on the surface, often superficial, not wanting to dig deep, trying to look to the middle of the road when the deeper truths are below the road. Yeah, that's part of the challenge that Obama has. Yes, my dear sister. Wonderful question. We're looking for that Aristotelian golden mean between, on the one hand, questing to be great, service to others, and the quest to be successful, gaining access to position, monetary, money, and so forth, to be in a position where you can use your power and influence and so on, you see. And I think that has so much to do with that idea that we started this evening with. What do we mean by wisdom? And how can wisdom be incarnate in your own life? Because wisdom is about wise judgment, practical judgment, walking that balance. When I talked about Abraham Lincoln, was he in a position of tremendous power? Absolutely. Was he wise in 1871 when he won? Not as wise as he was when he was shot. But he was always on that tightrope. Martin King would be another example, you see. And there's women examples and gay examples and brown and red and yellow examples of this, you see. But each person has to answer that for themselves. There's no one model that we imitate. There's examples that we can be inspired by and instructed by, you see. But it's precisely that balance that we're after, you see. Look at people like Fannie Lou Hamer. What was the power of Fannie Lou Hamer? She was a sharecropper. She had 9 kids. She'd been beat so bad today she couldn't see out of one eye. And yet when she appeared in Atlantic City, she just galvanized the whole attention of the world because of her what? Her moral authority. What was the power of Emmett Till's mother? Moral authority. When she said what she said in front of the world. A spiritual and moral authority. That's a power. Without money, and I'm not suggesting that we be broke. You know what I mean? Because, you know, it is nice to have a little cash. Let's just keep this thing real, you know. And Fannie Lou needed some cash, no doubt. But cash was always a means to an end. It was always a vehicle for the quest for greatness. That's what we're talking about. And of course, that's why we need one another. That's why the conversation between your fellow students of all colors from all around the world is so rich, and you're so privileged to be able to have this kind of discussion at Princeton, because all are going to enact it in very different ways. And we learn from each other owing to the fact that we enact it in so many different ways. Yes,
My name is Steve. I'm a freshman engineer too. My question is, if you say the American Empire is at its decline right now, what would you say was at its peak?
When was it at its peak? It's a good question. It's a good question. Well, one is that we know with the end of the age of Europe, which was 1945, which was the collapse of Europe, the continent itself divided, depended on 2 empires, the Soviet Empire. The Soviet Empire repressive, regimenting, violating rights and liberties, magnificent constitution. Oh, we believe in freedom of press and so forth. The Constitution had the weight of a snowball in hell. When you looked on the ground at its practices, that empire against the American Empire, American Empire triumphed, no doubt. America can still have its peak in its democratic form if we're able to pull it off. So it's hard to confine ourselves to our peak just by looking back. But there's no doubt that in the 1960s and 70s, when we broke the back of American apartheid, when we began to break the back of American patriarchy against our women of all colors, when we opened up and acknowledged the humanity of our gay brothers and lesbian sisters and the physically handicapped, for the first time we had free health care for our elderly. Those are humanizing elements of a democratic experiment that allows an empire to actually move to its peak morally, not necessarily militarily. Because at the same time you had Vietnam. At the same time you had a host of various interventions in Latin America. You know, Dominican Republic in 65, overthrowing Goulart in Brazil in 64. We can go on and on and on. So that it's a complicated question, my brother, but I think we have to be clear about what we're appealing to, what standards we're appealing to. Military, moral, not just political stability, but the just elements within the political stability, because fascist societies can be politically stable. North Korea is probably relatively stable at the moment. We know it's going to collapse pretty soon, but it's stable, but it's vast injustice, vast violation of rights and liberties and so forth, you see. So that the keeping the eye on these deep democratic qualities is what I'm after, very much so. Appreciate the question, though. One last question, my dear sister. There we go. Oh, I don't know if we have time, but we have this. You go right here.
So how can we incorporate
How do we attempt to make accountability and responsibility and answerability more real and concrete in the United States? Is that a fair characterization of your question? I think the only way you do it is people have to muster the courage to cultivate critique. They have to be organized, they have to be mobilized, and they have to bring pressure to bear as counterweights to the powerful influential factors like lobbyists and so forth that oftentimes are concerned just about highly privatized interests as opposed to public interests. There has to be counterweight. Brother Jeff Stout has a magnificent book coming out called Blessed Are the Organized. Now see, that's a book every freshman at Princeton ought to read. Blessed are the organized. Why? Because in the end, when it comes to poor people and working people, all poor and working people often have their bodies and their voices. This is one of the reasons why they tend to be the greatest song writers and singers, right? I mean, working class Italian brother from Hoboken. There's Frank Sinatra. Slumping proletariat black brother from Storyville, New Orleans. There's Louis Armstrong. Poor people often have only their bodies, their voices, love of family and friends, and organization. They have no money. They have no lobbyists. You see what I mean? We need more persons who are well-to-do, middle class, working class, whatever, concerned about poor and working people and who are part of organizing efforts. And in the age of Obama, we have to distinguish between grassroots organizing and AstroTurf networking. They're not the same thing. Right. America for Obama had 15 million people. What happened to America for Obama? It was subsumed under the DNC, under the Democratic National Committee. So it became now just a matter of extension of the party, you see. Which means it was not grassroots organizing, it was AstroTurf networking. Because when you engage in grassroots organizing, there's a change in you and your view of the world so that you're concerned about the cause, not just concerned about the candidate. And the candidate is just a means to pursue the cause. You don't push the candidate into office and then go off and have tea in Starbucks for the next 6 months. Well, maybe I shouldn't say about Starbucks. I don't want to downplay their possibilities, entrepreneurial possibilities, even though they're doing very well, that's all right. Grassroots organizing is constant. You're forever vigilant. It's not just mobilize for a moment, internet, voted, go back to my everyday life. That's AstroTurf networking. You see, it's like that's the difference between superficial romance and gut bucket mature love. Superficial romance, oh, it's so nice to be with you. I'll catch you on Thursday. What about Wednesday? Well, no, I'm watching television that night, but can't wait to talk to you on Thursday. Gut bucket mature love is what? Haven't you called me 6 times in the last 5 minutes? Yeah, baby, but I just can't do without you, so I'm calling again. I just want to let you know you're on my mind. I think I get the point. Go on and do what you got to do. Qualitative difference. One cuts to the gut, the other on the surface.